I am Penelope, author of epic fantasy and paranormal romance, and welcome to My Imaginary Friends, a look behind the scenes of an author mapping the worlds in my head and making them a reality. Hello, friends. Today is Friday, January 10th, 2020, and this is episode 50 of My Imaginary Friends. I'm Leslie. So this week's best thing, I'm not going to use anything related to RWA as this week's best thing, because while the resignation of the president and the executive director are good things, they just don't rise to the level. So I'm just going to list a few things that happened this week, other things that happened this week that I'm very grateful for. I graduated from physical therapy. I'm super excited about that. We had a vet visit for my kitten, and he's totally healthy, which is nice to know. My mom had a small surgery on her eye, and it all went well and was successful. Super grateful about that. I went climbing, I had a massage, and the writing is going well. So those are really good things that happened this week that have nothing to do with RWA, even though that whole situation is still top of mind. I'm trying to reprioritize, put it in its proper perspective as things continue to progress. Writing update. Like I said, it's going well. I had to pivot away from some of the scenes I was working on because I was starting to get mired, but I was like, well, let me work on a different section of the book. Usually I write in order, but because this book has 3 major POVs along with a secondary POV that comes in, and they're all kind of doing their own thing until they converge, I'm able to write each person's story almost on its own for a large chunk. And then they all come together around the midpoint of the book. So in the revision, I got stuck on one POV. I was like, well, let me just let that sit a little longer. I will go to this other POV that I know, is much more clear. It's much more straightforward, and right to the end of that. And at the same time, I will be brainstorming and sort of replotting the one that is still a little sticky. So that has been going really nicely. I have been writing every day, getting up at, between 6 and 6:30 and writing. All positive things. One logistical thing that I've been thinking about is, I'm trying to incorporate more exercise into my day and do something at least like 5 or 6 days a week. And I know from experience that the thing that I do first is the thing that gets done. So that's why I've been getting up early and writing first, because no matter what else happens in my day, I've written. But I'm sort of torn as to whether I should be exercising first. And it's like, you can only have one first priority, The writing is definitely a high priority, but I've let the exercising slide a lot. And so if I wake up first and exercise, then I'm writing later. It's a little easier for other things to kind of interfere. I might get a phone call or the temptation to check my email, or the email pops up on my phone. Actually, my work email does not pop up on my phone. Only my personal email does. I set that up a long time ago because I just can't have work email just in my face all the time. But the later it gets in the day, the more tension arises. So I've been thinking of alternating, like one day write first, one day exercise first, and see how that goes, because they're both high priorities. And, if I put the exercising off, like, I'll do it in the afternoon, and the afternoon comes and I'm tired and I want to take a nap and I have to push myself, and it's too easy to skip it. So it makes sense to do it first, but I really like first thing in the morning, just going, making some tea and sitting down to write. And that seems to work really well. So that is the current conundrum that I have been thinking about. I had finished watching The Witcher, I guess a week or 2 ago, and I talked about it a couple weeks ago briefly, but yeah, I kept thinking that I was going to get into it more and like it more. But as each episode progressed, I feel like I liked it less and less. And by the last episode, I just did not care about anybody. And that was my main problem with The Witcher. I never really cared about anyone because I was just spending so much time trying to figure out what was happening. So for me, it wasn't the timeline issue. So The Witcher it starts out in the first half with 3 different timelines. So you're seeing characters and they're like sometimes 50 years apart, but they give you clues. And I actually went back and rewatched the first episode because that was the source of my confusion. Like at the very beginning, the way that they tell the story. Now, so aside from the timelines, I know I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I'm trying to gather my thoughts together, but aside from the timeline issue, because that wasn't my main problem with it. I actually thought that was clever. I was fine with that, that level of confusion. And then, you get some clues. And as it goes forward, you're like, oh, okay. So this is before this. And then this happens. And then it comes together and you're like, wow, that was really nice. My problem is actually the storytelling. There was so much telling. And at one point, it was the first or second episode, one character is just spewing proper nouns at you about countries and leaders and kings and places that you don't actually ever see most of them in the show. Just tossing proper nouns at you that's my least favorite fantasy thing that happens ever. If I open a fantasy book, and the first paragraph is nothing but proper nouns, I close it immediately. World building is difficult, and when you have a fantasy world and you're trying to acclimate people to the rules of it, it's a hard job. I know from experience. So I appreciate that. But I feel like the show was maybe made for people who had read the books and played the games. And that if you're coming in fresh, they didn't care so much if you knew what was happening. And I'm all for dropping you in and giving it to you piece by piece as you go along. But I feel like the pieces they gave you were huge chunks and then nothing. And then maybe a huge chunk later on. Aside from the world building, just the basic storytelling was so choppy. And like in the first episode, we have a character, Renfrey, who I kept thinking something more over the course of the season was going to come from that incident with her. And I was like, is she going to pop up? The Witcher's interactions with her definitely had a resonant effect in his life. I got that. But the whole thing with Lilith, I kept expecting Lilith to actually show up. And I'm trying not to spoil it if you haven't seen it. But like there's situations and characters mentioned in the first episode that I thought were going to be really important. And they were actually just a one-off toss-away thing. That was an issue for me. Overall, I think the biggest problem was they tried to pack 25 episodes into 8. And that didn't work for me. World building had holes in it. I did a whole Twitter thread on the problems with the magic system, and I will link that in the show notes because the magic system was ridiculous. They go out of their way to show you people learning magic. So they show you some of the rules, and then never again do those rules come into play, it seems like. Or occasionally, yeah, they sometimes come into play and they sometimes don't. And the rules that they set aren't the rules that they follow. And that was very frustrating. I will say this, that I watched the whole thing. I was intrigued. Part of it was confusion, but I was intrigued enough to want to continue watching it and maybe watch the second season, I guess. But season 2 is not really a must watch. It's more like, oh, people are talking about this again. I guess I'll check it out and see if it got any better. So that's my attempts at a review. It wasn't for me. It was not my catnip at all. And sort of, not really related, but kind of, I saw a tweet that was apparently something that Raymond Chandler, the author, had written about science fiction in 1953. And it's this long parody of hard sci-fi, I guess. And it starts, did you ever read what they call science fiction? It's a scream. It's written like this. I checked out with K-19 on Aldebaran 3 and stepped out through the Chromolite hatch on my 22 model Sirius hardtop. I cocked the time injector in secondary and waded through the bright blue mandergrass. That's kind of how I felt watching The Witcher. It goes on. It's pretty funny. So I'll link to that as well. Yeah, hard sci-fi, I'm not a huge fan of. Like, I read a lot of William Gibson and Neil Stephenson, and those are hard sci-fi, I guess. And those were difficult. Like, I remember reading Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson and just took me forever. My head hurt the whole time. But ultimately, I enjoyed it. I think that I don't read hard sci-fi anymore because my brain space is taken up by so much else. If I wasn't writing and if I was just, doing my work like coding, doing website work, then I would have the brain capacity to delve through hard sci-fi. That energy drain from creative work that I've talked about before. Certain types of fiction reading pulls at that same muscle, I think. And high fantasy, hard sci-fi, where you really are digging deep and doing a lot of work as a reader. Literary fiction also, doing a lot of work as a reader. It requires a store of mental energy that I use up, I'll say. Romance, on the other hand, does not generally require as much work on the reader's part. And I think that's why it gets a bad rap, and that's why it gets criticized a lot. I love romance. This is not a pejorative. I love that. I like this aspect of romance. I like that I can sit and enjoy it without overworking myself and still come out on the other end having a great experience and, having, run through the gamut of emotions and all the things that you're looking for in a romance book. You're looking for different things in different genres, different types of fiction. So it's perfectly fine, but it's just good to know. So it's like when I do have, some more brain space available, I'll sink into something that I know is going to be a little bit more difficult. YA versus adult fantasy. YA fantasy is, in general, lighter world building. It doesn't mean it can't be wonderful world building. Some of my favorite books are YA fantasy, but it just uses your brain muscle in different ways. And finally, as I think about, what's next for RWA and the path forward, and people are talking about that, I think about goals and expectations. What do you want? What are you trying to achieve? Is it achievable? Is it measurable? What kind of organization do we want, and what does it look like? When people say we have to kick all the racists out of RWA, that doesn't seem like a measurable and achievable goal. And I understand the emotion behind it, but I don't understand what that even means, what that looks like. What's this test that we're applying to see if someone's racist, and who gets to judge that? I talked about that before. But, moving forward, not wanting to have these problems again. I know that SIFWA went through epic race fails, and they seem to have leveled out somewhat. I'm sure there's still issues, but, where can we go? And there was this tweet from someone who says that she does diversity and inclusion work, and it's about calling out versus calling in. One thing that I struggle with as I observe people talking about this situation and what's the way forward? And so this idea in this tweet thread about calling out versus calling in, and kind of simplistically, this person says that calling out is public correction to establish or enforce community norms. It's boundary setting. When someone goes on a public forum, social media, and says, this thing is racist, this person is racist, I'm going to screenshot this and tell you what I feel about that. That person's goal is not to change the behavior of the individual they're calling out. That person's goal is to reinforce these community norms, to say that in this community that I am a part of, or that I wish to be a part of, this is not acceptable. And here is why. And I think it's a way to find others who share that opinion. And that makes sense to me. Calling in is a private conversation with the goal of getting someone to change their behavior. I could just go back to, what are we trying to achieve? What are the goals? What are these measurable actions that we can take to make this organization, a community that feels safe and welcoming to all? This kind of relates to this editorial in the Washington Post that was talking about Ricky Gervais and his Golden Globes, I guess the intro. I saw a clip of it, and essentially he was calling out Hollywood stars for trying to appear morally superior when they get up on stage and give their acceptance speeches, and use that platform to promote some sort of, social or political good. But they're on, Apple and Amazon and Disney shows, these big companies creating these streaming services and these big companies that have a lot of problems. And he goes, if ISIS started a streaming service, you'd call your agent, wouldn't you? And it was a vicious kind of takedown. So the part in the article that I thought was interesting was talking about a paper from the Journal of Psychological Science. And it says it reported a series of experiments demonstrating that we give people moral credit for condemning bad behavior, more credit than we give them for just stating that they themselves behave morally. That's kind of like calling out. We view the people who call out as more moral than if someone is just like, oh, I'm not racist. But, and it's just a psychological thing that we do. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that people in this situation in RWA who are, vocally calling out things that are offensive and racist are being hypocritical in any way. I mean, we're all hypocrites to some degree, but that's not my point. My point is that if calling out is creating boundaries in a community, you receive rewards from that community for doing so. But if calling out does not change the behavior of the person who's being called out, then what were the goals? Are people consciously just doing this to create community and to reinforce these ideals? Or are they trying to create real change? And are those things mutually exclusive? I mean, I think you need both, obviously. And I don't have, once again, I don't have any answers. These are just questions that I'm asking. Mostly from a stand of, no one's ever going to be completely happy. We asked for resignations. We got resignations. That's not all that has to be done, obviously. Some people are just done with RWA and say that it can't be saved. And some people have the opposite view that it can be saved. But what does that look like? What will it take? People are saying, well, instead of, like right now, there's no president of the board and they're taking the announcement said that they're going to take some time. Some people are calling for special elections, which, as far as I know, are not a part of the bylaws. And I think it was Helen Kay or Leslie Kelly, one of the previous presidents, was like, hey, slow down on the asking for special elections because we don't want to just start making up new rules right now. Who knows where that could lead? Nobody really knows the way forward. It's murky, and without having a clear goal of what a way forward might look like, without having a clear goal of what the organization you want looks like, you can't get there. If you're going to have a professional organization, you're going to have to accept that that everyone's not going to agree and think the same way about things. Obviously, it crosses a line. We've heard a lot of stories, and I've experienced things in RWA and nationals, and, local chapter meetings too, that mirror other experiences in real life from a variety of people with a different way of viewing the world. Some of them recognize my humanity. Some of them act in ways which prove that they do not recognize my humanity in the same way. Should I expect RWA to be better than America? So yeah, the way forward is difficult. I think we have to envision what we want it to look like and be realistic. Are there any other organizations that look like this? What are they? Who is in them? How do you create this? And if it's not something that exists in the world, is it something that could feasibly be created anew? That's it for me for this week. These are my thoughts. Thank you so much for listening. Next week, I will be at MarsCon in Williamsburg, Virginia. Super excited about that. I will be one of the guests of honor at the conference, the YA author guest of honor. And check out the podcast 2YA or not 2YA. I don't know which number it was, but for my thoughts on that. Still a little bit worried about small children coming up to my table to read the books, but we'll see what happens. So I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope for a lot less drama for everyone. For episode show notes and to sign up for the Footnotes newsletter, go to myimaginaryfriendsshow.com. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and check out the video episodes on YouTube. I'd love a rating or review to help support the show. And My Imaginary Friends is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. For more podcasts you'll love, check out frolic.media/podcasts.